Before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. You'll want to buckle in for this one. Enjoy the story. The taste of copper filled my mouth before I even opened my eyes. Metallic. Wrong. Like I'd been chewing on pennies for hours. My head felt like someone had taken a plasma torch to the inside of my skull, and when I tried to move, every muscle screamed in protest. The surface beneath me was cold, unforgiving metal, not the worn mattress of my apartment back in Portland, where I'd fallen asleep playing Dead Space for the 100th time. "Carter! Jake Carter! You with us?" The voice cut through the fog in my brain like a rusty blade. I forced my eyes open, immediately regretting it as harsh fluorescent lighting stabbed into my retinas. Shapes moved above me, faces I didn't recognize wearing concerned expressions. "There he is," said a woman with short auburn hair and kind eyes. Her uniform bore the name Dr. Janet Young. "Easy now. You took quite a hit during the plasma storm. Been out for 6 hours. Plasma storm." The words should have meant something, but my mind felt disconnected, like trying to remember a dream after waking. I pushed myself up on my elbows, wincing as the movement sent lightning through my skull. "Where?" My voice came out as a croak. "Where am I?" The woman, Dr. Young, exchanged a glance with the man beside her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face you'd expect to see in a recruiting poster. His name tag read, Teal'c Mitchell. "USG Callisto," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to delivering bad news. "Deep space mining vessel. You're part of the maintenance crew, remember? We pulled you from Sector 7 after the storm hit." USG Callisto. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, followed immediately by a flood of memories that felt both mine and not mine. Working on this ship for 3 months. The excitement when Command announced we'd been assigned to investigate the USG Ishimura, a massive planet cracker that had gone silent near Aegis 7. But underneath those memories, older ones clawed at my consciousness. Memories of sitting in a dimly lit room, controller in hand, watching Isaac Clarke navigate the blood-soaked corridors of a mining ship. Watching him fight creatures that shouldn't exist. Creatures called Necromorphs. My hands started shaking. "The Ishimura," I whispered. "Tell me we haven't boarded the Ishimura." Dr. Young's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Boarded? Jake, we've been in orbit around her for 2 weeks. She's completely dead. No life signs, no power, nothing. But the salvage teams have been bringing back some incredible artifacts." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. Artifacts. In the game, it was always the artifacts that started everything. The red marker. The thing that turned dead tissue into nightmares. What kind of artifacts? I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Religious relics, mostly," Mitchell said. "Strange writing, geometric patterns. The science team is going crazy over them. Dr. Elizabeth Weir thinks they might be from an unknown civilization. I had to get out of here. Had to see what they'd brought aboard." But as I swung my legs over the side of the medical table, a wave of dizziness nearly sent me back down. "Whoa there!" Dr. Young caught my arm. "You need to take it slow. That plasma surge did a number on your nervous system." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to stand despite the world tilting sideways. "I need to get back to work." "The hell you do." Mitchell stepped forward, blocking my path. "Doc says you rest. You rest. Ship's running fine without you for a few more hours." Through the medical bay's viewport, I could see it. The USG Ishimura hung in the void like a dead whale, its massive bulk blocking out the stars. Even from this distance, even knowing it was just metal and plastic, something about it made my skin crawl. It looked exactly like it had in the game. That distinctive design that had haunted my nightmares for years. "How long have the salvage teams been going over there?" I asked. "Started yesterday," Dr. Young said, making notes on her tablet. "First real breakthrough was this morning. They found some kind of storage chamber deep in the ship, perfectly preserved." My blood went cold. "They brought something back this morning?" "A whole collection," Mitchell said, pride evident in his voice. "Dr. Weir nearly fainted when she saw them. Says it could rewrite our understanding of..." An alarm started blaring. Not the general quarters alarm I'd grown used to, but something different, something urgent and terrifying. The lights in the medical bay shifted from white to red, bathing everything in a hellish glow. "All personnel to emergency stations," a voice crackled over the intercom. It belonged to Commander Daniel Jackson, the Callisto's captain. But there was something wrong with his tone, a barely controlled panic that made my intestines twist into knots. "We have multiple casualties in Science Bay 3. Medical teams respond immediately." Dr. Young was already moving, grabbing her emergency kit. "Jake, you stay here. Don't even think about leaving this room." But I was already following them out the door, my legs steadier than they had any right to be. The corridors of the Callisto stretched before us, lined with exposed piping and junction boxes that I knew by heart from both my real memories and countless hours of gameplay. Everything was exactly as it should be, down to the worn spots on the floor plating where crew members' boots had traced the same paths day after day. We reached Science Bay 3 to find chaos. Security officers had cordoned off the entrance, but I could see past them into the lab. Red emergency lighting painted everything in shades of blood, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. Copper and ozone and something else. Something organic and wrong. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell breathed beside me. On the floor of the lab, 3 bodies lay in positions that defied anatomy. Their limbs were twisted at impossible angles, and their faces were gone. Not torn away, not burned off, but simply absent, leaving only smooth expanses of skin where features should have been. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the 4th body. Or what had been the 4th body. Dr. Sarah Henderson from the archaeology team was still moving, but she shouldn't have been. Not with her spine bent backward at a 90-degree angle. Not with her arms hanging limp and her head lolling at a sickening angle. She turned toward us, and I saw that her face was intact, but her eyes were wrong. Completely white, like someone had painted over them with milk. When she opened her mouth, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a wet, chittering noise that made every primitive part of my brain scream in terror. "Outbreak protocol!" someone shouted. "Seal the bay." But it was too late. The thing that had been Dr. Henderson moved with impossible speed, launching itself at the security barrier. I watched in horrified fascination as her broken body contorted, bones popping and cracking as they rearranged themselves into something more efficient for killing. The first scream came from Officer Rodney McKay as Henderson's fingers, now impossibly long and ending in razor-sharp points, punched through his chest armor like it was paper. Blood sprayed across the corridor walls in arterial patterns I recognized from too many late-night gaming sessions. That's when it hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. This wasn't just familiar because I'd worked on this ship. This was familiar because I'd lived through it 100 times before, safe behind a computer screen with a plasma cutter in virtual hands. I was inside Dead Space. Not the game, the reality. A parallel Earth where Isaac Clarke's nightmare was just another Tuesday, and I was trapped right in the middle of it. And if my memory served me right, we were only at the very beginning. The creature that had been Dr. Henderson turned its eyeless gaze toward me, tilting its head like a curious predator. When it smiled, I could see that its teeth had multiplied, filling its mouth in neat, shark-like rows. Then the lights went out completely, and in the darkness, I heard something much worse than screaming. I heard laughter. Human laughter. Coming from things that were no longer human. The infection had begun. In the absolute darkness, time became meaningless. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal as inhuman sounds echoed through the corridors. Wet, sliding noises that spoke of things moving where they shouldn't. The emergency lighting flickered back on in stuttering intervals, casting dancing shadows that made every corner a potential death trap. "Emergency power restored to Section C." Commander Jackson's voice crackled through the intercom, but there was a tremor in it now that hadn't been there before. "All personnel report to designated safe zones immediately. This is not a drill." But I knew better than anyone that there were no safe zones on a ship infected with necromorphs. "Carter!" Dr. Young grabbed my arm, her medical training overriding her obvious terror. "We need to move. Now." The thing that had been Dr. Henderson was gone, leaving only dark stains on the corridor floor and the acrid smell of ozone mixed with something far worse. Through the emergency lighting's hellish glow, I could see other crew members emerging from doorways, their faces painted with the same dawning horror I felt churning in my gut. "Where do we go?" asked a voice behind me. I turned to see Chief Engineer Sarah O'Neill, her usually pristine uniform torn and splattered with something I didn't want to identify. Her hands shook as she clutched a modified plasma torch, the closest thing to a weapon she could find. "Bridge," Teal'c Mitchell said, checking his sidearm. "Commander Jackson will know what to do." I almost laughed. In the game, Isaac's first instinct was always to reach the bridge too, and it was always the wrong choice. By the time you got there, Command was either dead or transformed into something that wore their faces like masks. "No," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "The bridge is compromised. We need to get to the shuttle bay." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "How the hell do you know that?" "Because I've lived through this nightmare 100 times before," I wanted to say. "Because I know exactly how this infection spreads and where it goes first. Because in every playthrough, the command structure falls within the first hour." Instead, I said, "The artifacts they brought back, where are they being stored?" "Research Lab Alpha," Dr. Young answered without thinking. "Level 3, directly below the bridge." "But why does that—" Her words were cut off by a sound that made my blood freeze. Somewhere above us, metal was being torn apart with impossible strength. Long, screeching tears that spoke of claws capable of ripping through reinforced bulkheads like paper. "It's spreading upward," I whispered, pieces of the puzzle clicking together in my mind. "The artifact is broadcasting some kind of signal. The infection starts from wherever they stored it and moves outward." "Signal?" O'Neill stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Jake, people don't just turn into whatever that was because of signals." Another scream echoed from somewhere far above, followed by the distinctive sound of plasma weapons firing. The shots came in rapid bursts at first, then slowed, then stopped altogether. In the silence that followed, we heard something much worse. The wet, organic sounds of tissue being rearranged. "They do here," I said grimly. "We need weapons. Real ones. And we need to reach the shuttle bay before the infection spreads to the hangar controls." Mitchell grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around to face him. "Carter, you're talking like you know what's happening. Like you've seen this before." I had. God help me, I had. But how could I explain that I'd spent years perfecting strategies for surviving on infected spacecraft? That I knew which weapons worked best against which types of necromorphs? That I could navigate the ship's layout from memory because I'd run these corridors in virtual reality until they were burned into my brain? "I've read about incidents like this," I lied. "Deep space psychosis events, alien pathogens. The best survival strategy is always to evacuate immediately." It wasn't entirely false. In the game's lore, there had been other outbreaks, other ships, other markers spreading their influence across the galaxy like a virus made of madness and death. "The armory," O'Neill said suddenly. "Level 2, Section D. If we're going to fight our way out of here, we'll need better than this." She hefted her plasma torch, its blue flame guttering in the recycled air. I nodded. The armory was a good choice. It had multiple exit routes and enough firepower to cut through the early-stage necromorphs we'd be facing. But I also knew what we'd find there. And the knowledge sat in my stomach like a lump of ice. We moved through the corridors in single file, Mitchell taking point with his sidearm drawn. The Callisto felt different now. The familiar hum of the engines seemed muted, and there were new sounds bleeding through the ventilation system. Chittering, scraping, and underneath it all, a low harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. "You hear that?" Dr. Young whispered. I did. It was the Marker's song, a psychic frequency that burrowed into human consciousness and rewrote it from the inside out. In the game, prolonged exposure led to hallucinations, violent psychosis, and eventually complete mental breakdown. "We need to move faster," I said. The first body we found was in Junction 7 Alpha, maintenance worker Timothy Anderson, a guy I'd shared coffee with just yesterday morning. He was pinned to the wall by what looked like bone spears that had grown from his own ribcage, his face frozen in an expression of agony and confusion, but Anderson's body was still twitching. "Jesus," Mitchell breathed, raising his weapon. "Don't," I said quickly. Not yet. Some of them play dead. As if summoned by my words, Anderson's head snapped toward us with a wet crack of vertebrae. His eyes had gone completely white, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had fused together into a solid ridge of yellowed bone. The bone spears withdrew into his chest with a sound like retracting hydraulics, and Anderson dropped to the floor. For a moment, he looked almost normal, just a maintenance worker who'd taken a bad fall. Then his spine began to extend. I'd seen this transformation dozens of times in the game, but witnessing it in reality was something else entirely. The sound alone, the wet tearing of flesh, and the grinding of bone against bone, was enough to make Dr. Young vomit against the corridor wall. Anderson's spine pushed through the skin of his back like a bloody antenna, growing longer and more complex by the second. Additional vertebrae sprouted from the original, creating a writhing tentacle of bone and cartilage that ended in a mouth lined with human teeth. "Lurker," I whispered. "What?" Mitchell kept his gun trained on the thing, but his hands were shaking. "That's what they call them. The spine becomes a projectile weapon. Don't let it get a clear shot." The Anderson thing raised its head, and I could see intelligence there, malevolent and alien, but unmistakably aware. It was learning our positions, calculating angles of attack. The spine tentacle swayed like a cobra preparing to strike. Mitchell fired first. The plasma bolt took Anderson in the chest, burning a hole through his maintenance uniform and into the flesh beneath. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it laughed, a sound that was half human chuckle and half insectoid clicking. "Center mass won't work," I said, remembering countless late-night gaming sessions. "You have to dismember them. Take out the limbs." Dismember? O'Neill stared at me in horror. "Jake, these used to be people." "Not anymore." The spine tentacle lashed out like a whip, and I threw myself sideways as bone spears shot past my head to embed themselves in the corridor wall. The creature was already preparing another volley when Mitchell adjusted his aim and fired at its legs. The plasma blast severed Anderson's left leg at the knee, and the thing toppled sideways with a shriek that was part pain and part rage. But it wasn't finished. The severed leg began to twitch and crawl across the floor like a pale spider, while Anderson's remaining limbs contorted to accommodate his new mobility requirements. "Multiple targets now," I called out, tracking the crawling leg with my eyes. "The severed parts stay active." Dr. Young had stopped vomiting and was staring at the scene with the fascination of a medical professional confronted with something that shouldn't exist. "The neural activity is still present in the disconnected tissue," she said with clinical detachment. "How is that possible?" "Alien pathogen," I said, which was close enough to the truth. "It rewrites cellular structure at the molecular level." The Anderson thing launched itself at O'Neill, using its remaining leg and both arms to propel itself across the floor in a grotesque parody of a sprint. She met it with her plasma torch, the blue flame cutting through its right shoulder and separating the arm from the torso. Now we had three separate threats: the main body, the crawling leg, and the severed arm that was clawing its way toward Mitchell's ankles. "This is insane!" O'Neill panted, backing away from Anderson's limbless torso as it tried to bite her with its fused teeth. "How do we kill something that won't die?" "Destroy the head and spine," I said, remembering the game's damage system. Without the central nervous system, the individual parts shut down. Mitchell put 2 more shots into Anderson's skull, and finally, blessedly, the creature stopped moving. The severed limbs twitched once more and then went still, leaving us alone in the corridor with the smell of burned flesh and ozone. "How did you know all that?" Dr. Young asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her revulsion. "Lucky guess," I lied, but we didn't have time for more questions. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, coming from multiple directions now. Other crew members were encountering their own transformed colleagues, and from the sound of it, they weren't having as much success as we'd had. The armory doors were sealed when we reached them, red warning lights indicating a security lockdown. But O'Neill had engineer's clearance, and after a few tense moments of typing in access codes, the heavy blast doors ground open to reveal the Callisto's weapon storage, and the 3 Necromorphs feeding on Chief Security Officer Jonas Quinn's remains. These weren't like Anderson. These were further along in their transformation, their human features completely subsumed by the alien infection. One had arms that ended in blade-like projections of bone. Another moved on 4 legs that had once been human arms and legs, its head hanging upside down from where its torso should be. The third was the worst, a bloated thing that barely looked human at all. Its skin stretched tight over what looked like a cluster of smaller bodies trying to push their way out. Slasher, lurker, and pregnant, I said automatically, then caught myself. I mean, different mutation types. We need pulse rifles, and line guns if they have them. How the hell do you know their names? Mitchell demanded, but he was already moving toward the weapon racks. Because I've been killing these things in virtual reality for years, I thought. Because I know their attack patterns, their weak points, their behavioral algorithms, because in some twisted way, this is the game I know better than any other. Does it matter? I said instead, grabbing a pulse rifle and checking its ammunition counter. Right now, knowledge is keeping us alive. The Necromorphs had noticed us. The slasher moved first, those bone blades extending from its arms like organic swords. It covered the distance between us in 3 impossibly long strides, moving with predatory grace that belonged in nightmares. I put 6 rounds into its legs, watching the plasma bolts sever muscle and bone with surgical precision. The creature toppled forward, its mobility destroyed, but the blade arms kept swinging. One caught Dr. Young across the shoulder, tearing through her uniform and into the flesh beneath. The lurker was already launching its spine projectiles, filling the air with bone spears that embedded themselves in weapon racks and supply crates. O'Neill dove behind an ammunition locker, plasma torch forgotten in favor of a line gun that could cut through reinforced steel. But it was the pregnant that terrified me most. In the game, they were walking time bombs. Kill them wrong, and they'd split open to release a swarm of smaller necromorphs called swarmers. Each swarmer was individually weak, but in groups they could overwhelm even well-armed survivors. "Don't shoot center mass on the big one," I shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Limbs only." Mitchell ignored me, putting a full burst from his pulse rifle into the pregnant's distended torso. I watched in horror as the creature's skin split like overripe fruit, disgorging a dozen pale, spider-like things that immediately scattered across the armory floor. "Swarmers!" I yelled, switching to rapid-fire mode. "They go for the head and neck." The next few minutes were chaos. Plasma bolts lit up the armory like a laser light show as we fought against enemies that moved like liquid death. The swarmers were everywhere, crawling across the ceiling, skittering between our legs, launching themselves at our faces with suicidal determination. Dr. Young screamed as one latched onto her back, its needle-like appendages seeking the base of her skull. I spun and put 3 rounds into the creature, watching it explode in a shower of yellow ichor that steamed when it hit the metal floor. When the shooting finally stopped, we were alone among the weapon racks, breathing hard and covered in alien blood. But we were alive, and we were armed. "The shuttle bay," O'Neill said, hefting her line gun. "We get to the ships and we get off this death trap." I nodded, but something cold was growing in my stomach, because I knew what we'd find at the shuttle bay. I knew because I'd played through this scenario too many times to count. The ships would be gone. Or worse, they'd be there, but changed, infected, waiting to spread the contamination to whatever world we tried to reach. In Dead Space, there was never an easy escape. The marker made sure of that. As we left the armory and headed toward the hangar levels, I could hear it more clearly now. The song that resonated through the ship's superstructure. A harmonic frequency that bypassed human hearing and spoke directly to the brain's primitive fear centers. And underneath that song, I could hear something else, whispers, voices that sounded familiar, calling my name from empty corridors. The marker wasn't just converting the crew's bodies, it was converting their minds too. And the longer we stayed on this ship, the more likely it was that we'd join them. We had maybe an hour before the psychological effects became irreversible. An hour to reach the shuttle bay, secure transportation, and figure out how to destroy the source of the infection. An hour to do what Isaac Clarke had done, but in reality, instead of virtual space. Behind us, something roared in the darkness. A sound that spoke of hunger and rage and terrible purpose. The infection was spreading faster now, consuming the ship deck by deck. And somewhere in the growing chaos, I realized with sick certainty that our only chance of survival lay in returning to the one place none of us wanted to go. The USG Ishimura was waiting for us in the void, patient as death itself. The shuttle bay stretched before us like a cathedral of twisted metal, its vast space punctuated by the skeletal remains of what had once been our escape vessels. The Callisto shuttles hung from their docking clamps like broken birds, their hulls split open and their interiors changed. "Mother of God," O'Neill whispered, her line gun trembling in her hands. I'd expected this, but seeing it in reality was different. In the game, damaged shuttles were just environmental storytelling. Here, each destroyed craft represented dead crew members, failed escape attempts, and the systematic destruction of hope itself. The largest shuttle, the one we'd planned to use for evacuation, had its cargo bay doors torn open from the inside. Through the breach, I could see pale, web-like structures that pulsed with their own organic rhythm. The marker's influence was converting everything it touched, turning metal and plastic into something that resembled living tissue. "The corruption spreads to technology too," Dr. Young observed, her medical training allowing her to maintain clinical detachment even in the face of impossibility. "It's rewriting matter at the molecular level." She was right, but she didn't understand the full implications. In the game's lore, the marker didn't just create necromorphs from dead tissue. It could eventually transform entire star systems into massive organic networks. Planets became nodes in a galaxy-spanning intelligence that existed beyond human comprehension. "We can't use the shuttles," Mitchell said, stating the obvious. "So how do we get off this ship?" I turned toward the bay's massive viewing port, where the USG Ishimura hung in the void like a monument to humanity's hubris. Even from this distance, I could see that sections of the ship were wrong. Dark patches where the hull should have been uniform, organic growths spreading across the outer plating like cancer. "We don't get off the ship," I said quietly. "We go to the source." "The Ishimura?" O'Neill stared at me like I'd suggested jumping out an airlock. "Jake, that ship is where this nightmare started. It's probably crawling with those things." "It is," I agreed. "But it's also where the marker is. The original artifact that's broadcasting the signal. As long as it exists, the infection will keep spreading. Not just through our ship, but to anywhere we might try to escape." The truth was more complicated than that. In the game, destroying markers was nearly impossible. They were designed by an alien intelligence specifically to be self-perpetuating. But there were ways to disrupt their signals, to break the psychic chains that bound the Necromorphs to their will. "How do you know all this?" Dr. Young asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Jake, you've been talking like you understand this infection better than our entire science team." Before I could answer, a new sound echoed through the shuttle bay. A wet, sliding noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The organic matter coating the damaged shuttles began to pulse faster, and I could see movement within the twisted corridors of flesh. "We need to move," I said urgently. "Something big is coming." That's when I saw it emerging from the largest shuttle's corrupted interior. The thing had once been human. Multiple humans, actually. Their bodies had been fused together into a writhing mass of limbs and torsos that moved with the coordination of a single organism. Dozens of faces stared out from the amalgamated flesh, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. "Ubermorph," I breathed, recognizing the creature from the game's most terrifying encounters. This wasn't something we could fight. Ubermorphs were effectively immortal. Even if you dismembered them completely, they could regenerate from the smallest remaining pieces. The only way to stop them was to remove their power source, or trap them somewhere they couldn't escape. "Run," I said. We didn't need further encouragement. The creature's attention fixed on us with predatory focus, and it began to move with impossible speed for something of its size. Multiple arms reached out to grab handholds on the shuttle bay walls, pulling its massive bulk forward in a grotesque parody of climbing. I led the group toward the bay's emergency access tunnel, my fingers flying over the control pad from muscle memory I shouldn't have possessed. The tunnel connected to the Ishimura's docking port, a maintenance corridor designed for emergency repairs when ships were locked together. "Jake, that tunnel hasn't been pressurized," Mitchell called out as the heavy door ground open. "We'll need EVA suits." "No time," I said, already pulling on one of the emergency masks mounted near the door. "The corridor has its own life support. Basic, but it'll keep us alive long enough." Behind us, the Ubermorph let out a sound that was part roar and part choir, the voices of its component humans crying out in harmony. It was gaining ground, its multiple arms allowing it to move across the shuttle bay's walls and ceiling like a massive spider. We plunged into the access tunnel just as the creature reached the entrance. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 people, lined with exposed piping and emergency lighting that cast everything in a hellish red glow. I could hear the Ubermorph trying to follow us, its bulk too large for the narrow space, its frustrated screams echoing through the metal walls. "This is insane," O'Neill panted as we made our way through the cramped corridor. "Even if we reach the Ishimura, how do we know it won't be worse than the Callisto?" I didn't answer because I knew exactly how much worse it would be. The Ishimura had been dead for weeks, giving the infection time to spread through every deck and corridor. By now, the ship would be a floating tomb populated by creatures that had evolved far beyond anything we'd encountered on the Callisto, but it was also where this had all started. And in my experience with the game, problems like this had to be solved at their source. The docking port to the Ishimura was sealed, its blast doors locked tight. But O'Neill's engineering access codes still worked, and after a few tense moments, the massive doors ground open to reveal the airlock beyond. "Atmosphere on the other side is breathable," Dr. Young reported, checking her scanner. "But the biological readings..." She trailed off, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "How bad?" Mitchell asked. "The ship isn't just infected," she said quietly. "It's alive. The entire vessel is reading as a single massive organism." I'd seen this in the later stages of the game. When a marker had enough time and biomass to work with, it could convert entire environments into extensions of itself. Walls became nerve tissue, floors pulsed like skin, and the distinction between ship and creature disappeared entirely. We cycled through the airlock and stepped onto the USG Ishimura for the first time. The corridor beyond was barely recognizable as human construction. The metal walls had been covered with a fibrous organic growth that pulsed with its own bioluminescence. The floor beneath our feet felt soft and yielding, like walking on living tissue. And the smell, a mixture of copper, ozone, and something sickeningly sweet, made my eyes water. "Stay together," I said, raising my pulse rifle. "And watch the walls. Some of the creatures can hide in the organic matter." We moved through the ship's corridors like ghosts haunting a corpse. Emergency lighting flickered through the living walls, casting our shadows in constantly shifting patterns. The ship's layout was exactly as I remembered from countless playthroughs, but seeing it corrupted by the marker's influence was like watching a familiar friend transform into a monster. "Where are we going?" Dr. Young asked, her voice muffled by the emergency mask. "Engineering," I said. "If the marker is still active, that's where its power source will be connected to the ship's systems. But first, we had to survive the journey. The Ishimura had been dead for weeks, and that meant the Necromorphs here had had time to evolve. The creatures we encountered were unlike anything from the early stages of infection. Massive, complex organisms that seemed to have been designed for specific purposes. The first was waiting for us in the main corridor junction, and I recognized it with a sick feeling of dread. It had once been an entire security team, their bodies merged together into a single entity that stood nearly 10 feet tall. Multiple heads protruded from its shoulders and chest, while dozens of arms hung from its torso like a grotesque coat of mail. "Brute," I whispered. This one was different from the creatures we'd fought on the Callisto. It was larger, more sophisticated, and when it turned to look at us, I could see intelligence in its multiple sets of eyes. This wasn't just a reanimated corpse driven by alien instinct. It was something that could think, plan, and adapt. It charged us with surprising speed for something of its size, and I barely had time to dive aside as it smashed through the spot where I'd been standing. The impact left a crater in the living floor, and I could see smaller organisms crawling out of the wound like antibodies responding to injury. "Limbs!" I shouted, opening fire with my pulse rifle. "Take out the limbs!" But the brute had too many arms to disable quickly, and each time we severed one, 2 more seemed to take its place. The creature was regenerating in real time, drawing biomass from the ship's infected hull to repair and enhance itself. Mitchell and O'Neill flanked it from both sides, their combined fire finally managing to bring the thing down. But even as it fell, I could see the floor beginning to absorb the creature's remains, recycling its biological material for future use. "The ship is learning from our attacks," Dr. Young observed with clinical fascination. Each encounter makes it stronger. She was right, and that realization filled me with a cold dread. In the game, Necromorphs were dangerous but predictable. Here, they were actively evolving to counter our tactics. We pressed deeper into the ship, fighting our way through corridors that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. The organic growth on the walls had become more sophisticated, forming complex patterns that hurt to look at for too long, and the whispers were getting stronger. At first, it was just my name being called from empty rooms and shadowed alcoves. But as we descended toward the engineering levels, the voices became more complex. I heard my mother calling for help, my ex-girlfriend begging me to come back, my childhood dog barking from somewhere just around the next corner. "You're hearing them too," Dr. Young said, noticing my expression. I nodded. The marker's psychological effects. It uses memories to break down mental barriers. How do you fight something like that? You don't, I said honestly. You just try to hold on long enough to reach the source. But even as I said it, I could feel my own sanity beginning to fray at the edges. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent, and sometimes I caught myself almost responding to them. The line between reality and hallucination was blurring, and I knew that soon I might not be able to tell the difference. We reached engineering to find it transformed beyond recognition. The massive chamber that had once housed the ship's power systems was now filled with organic architecture that defied description. Curved walls of living tissue stretched up into darkness, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to our presence. And at the center of it all, suspended in a web of neural filaments, was the marker. It wasn't the sleek black obelisk from the game. This marker was clearly alien in origin. A twisted spire of crystalline material that seemed to bend light around itself. Symbols covered its surface, shifting and changing as I watched, and the harmonic vibration that had been haunting us was strongest here. "My God," O'Neill breathed. "It's beautiful." That was the marker's most insidious trap. Up close, it was hypnotically attractive, filling observers with a sense of religious awe that made them want to approach and touch its surface. I'd seen this effect in the game. Even Isaac Clarke, trained engineer and hardened survivor, had struggled against the marker's psychological influence. "Don't look at it directly," I warned, but Dr. Young was already moving forward. "The mathematical precision," she murmured, her scientific curiosity overriding her survival instincts. "The geometric patterns. This could revolutionize our understanding of physics, biology, consciousness itself." "Janet! No!" Mitchell lunged forward, but it was too late. Dr. Young's hand made contact with the marker's surface, and immediately her body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were showing, and when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out wasn't human. It was the same harmonic frequency that had been emanating from the artifact, but now it was being produced by human vocal cords. "She's become a conduit," I realized with horror. The transformation was rapid and terrible. Dr. Young's skin began to pale and stretch, her limbs elongating as the marker's influence rewrote her cellular structure. But unlike the chaotic mutations we'd seen elsewhere on the ship, this change was deliberate and precise. She was becoming something new, something that could serve as a direct interface between the marker and the infected biomass throughout the ship. "We have to stop this," O'Neill said, raising her line gun. "Wait," I said, an idea forming in my mind. In the game, destroying a marker required massive amounts of energy. But if we could disrupt the signal... I pulled out my plasma cutter, adjusting its focus to its narrowest setting. Instead of trying to destroy the marker itself, I aimed for the neural filaments connecting it to the ship's organic network. The first beam cut through the biological cables like a hot knife through butter, and immediately the marker's harmonic frequency shifted to a higher pitch. The thing that had been Dr. Young screamed, but it was still her voice underneath the alien harmonics. "She's still in there," I shouted over the rising sound. "Keep cutting the connections!" We focused our fire on the web of neural filaments, severing the marker's direct control over the ship's infected systems. With each cable we destroyed, the organic walls around us began to convulse and decay. The ship was dying, its artificial nervous system collapsing without the marker's guiding intelligence. But the artifact itself was fighting back. The symbols on its surface flared with blinding light, and I could feel its psychic influence pressing against my mind like a physical weight. Images flashed before my eyes. Visions of Earth consumed by necromorphs, of humanity transformed into something unrecognizable, of myself standing beside the marker as its willing servant. "Make us whole," the thing that had been Dr. Young whispered, her transformed features pleading with inhuman beauty. "Join us. Become part of something greater." For a moment, I almost wavered. The vision was seductive, an end to pain, to fear, to the crushing weight of individual consciousness. In the marker's embrace, there would be no more loneliness, no more uncertainty, no more death. But then I remembered why I was here. Not just to survive, but to prevent this nightmare from spreading beyond this ship. The parallel Earth I'd somehow fallen into wasn't my home, but it was still a world full of innocent people who deserved better than transformation into necromorphs. "I know how this ends," I said, raising my plasma cutter one final time. "And I won't let it happen." I put the beam directly into the base of the marker, where it connected to the ship's power systems. The alien artifact shrieked. Actually shrieked, the sound bypassing human hearing entirely and resonating directly in our bones. Cracks appeared in its crystalline surface, spreading upward like a spiderweb of light. The explosion that followed wasn't violent in the traditional sense. Instead, it was as if reality itself had been punctured, creating a brief window into the vast emptiness between dimensions. Through that window, I caught a glimpse of something that my mind immediately tried to forget. Vast intelligences moving in spaces that had too many angles, consciousness so alien that human perception simply couldn't process it. Then the window closed, the marker crumbled to dust, and the organic matter throughout the ship began to rapidly decay. The walls turned gray and brittle, the floor beneath our feet returned to normal metal plating, and the oppressive psychic pressure that had been building in my skull finally lifted. Dr. Young collapsed, her body returning to its normal human proportions, but her mind clearly shattered by what she'd experienced. She was alive, but the look in her eyes suggested that some essential part of her had been left behind in the marker's embrace. "Is it over?" O'Neill asked, looking around at the rapidly decaying organic matter. "For now," I said. But I knew better than to think it was truly finished. In the game's lore, markers were just tools used by something far larger and more terrible. Destroying one was like cutting off a single tentacle of a vast cosmic organism. "We need to get back to the Callisto," Mitchell said. "Set the reactor to overload and make sure nothing survives." I nodded, though part of me wondered if it would matter. The knowledge of how to create markers was already out there, scattered across multiple parallel Earths and dimensions. This outbreak might be contained, but there would be others. As we made our way back through the dying ship, I felt a strange sense of displacement, as if the fabric of reality around me was becoming unstable. The corridors seemed to shift and blur, and for brief moments I could see other versions of these same events playing out. Different choices, different outcomes, different fates for the crew of the Callisto. "Jake?" O'Neill said, her voice sounding distant. "You're starting to fade." I looked down at my hands and saw that she was right. My body was becoming translucent, as if I was slowly being erased from this reality. The marker's destruction, I realized. It's severing the connection that brought me here. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't from this parallel Earth at all. I was from somewhere else entirely. A dimension where dead space was just a video game, where necromorphs existed only in virtual reality. The marker's influence had somehow pulled me across dimensional barriers, trapping me in a reality where my worst gaming nightmares were real. "Will you be able to get home?" Mitchell asked. I could feel the pull now, a gentle but insistent force drawing me back toward my own dimension. It was like being tugged by an invisible rope, and I knew that resisting it would be impossible. "I think so," I said. "But listen to me. This isn't over. There are other markers out there, other ships, other outbreaks waiting to happen. You need to be ready." "How do we prepare for something like this?" O'Neill asked. "Study the infection patterns. Develop weapons specifically designed for dismemberment. And whatever you do, don't let anyone bring artifacts back from dead ships without extensive quarantine procedures." I was fading faster now, my body becoming little more than a ghost. But there was one more thing I needed to tell them. Something that might save lives in the future. The creatures have weak points, I said urgently. Slashers can be stopped by taking out their arms. Lurkers need their spine tentacles destroyed. Pregnant necromorphs split open when killed, so use long-range weapons. And if you ever encounter something called a regenerator... But I didn't get to finish the warning. The dimensional pull became irresistible, and I felt myself being stretched across impossible distances, pulled back toward a reality where monsters were made of pixels, and death could be undone with the press of a button. The last thing I saw was the 3 survivors standing in the corridor of the dying ship, their faces etched with determination and the hard-won knowledge that would help them survive whatever came next. Then I was falling through darkness, through spaces between spaces, until finally I crashed back into my own world. I woke up on my couch in Portland, my gaming controller still warm in my hands, and the Dead Space menu screen glowing on my television. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been an incredibly vivid dream brought on by too many late-night gaming sessions. But then I noticed the smell clinging to my clothes, ozone and copper, and something organic that made my stomach turn. And when I looked in the mirror, I could see faint scars on my hands and arms, marks that hadn't been there before I'd fallen asleep. I'd survived the USG Callisto. I'd helped destroy a marker and prevent an outbreak that could have consumed an entire parallel Earth. But more importantly, I'd learned something that chilled me to the bone. The multiverse was vast and full of realities where humanity's darkest fictions were real. And sometimes, the barriers between those realities were thinner than we imagined. I never played Dead Space again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the whispers calling my name from empty rooms. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of parallel dimensions, the markers are still singing their songs of transformation and unity, waiting for the next opportunity to make us whole.
Okay. Well, we're just doing some. I'm dehydrated. Well, Starfire.